Hello and welcome to presentation about our project on byproducts of high emissions. Inspiration for the subject came from a great podcast episode questioning if the economic growth or the endless pursuit of GDP should be our ultimate goal. To unreveal this more negative side of high GDP, we wanted to know if it's related to emission levels, and if there was a relationship, what would be the consequence on our society, which is why we also looked at some demographic factors. To do so, we use three different datasets: global development, emissions, and GDP dataset, using as a common key variables country and year. Interesting findings in EDA part. First, we saw that there is indeed a relationship between GDP and emissions. However, we saw no relationship between population growth and GDP. This was something to expect given the fact that with technology development, we went from zero to positive sum economy, meaning that more people does not mean less for everybody. Here, we saw that all countries have been converging to developed world cluster of high life expectancy and low fertility rate. We also saw that urban and rural population trends have reversed, as well as that people live much longer anywhere in the world. To answer our research questions, we decided to focus on top and bottom four polluters that remained pretty much the same between 1980 and 2012, just to see if certain trends were only true for big polluters or not. From our first research question, which was, does higher GDP also means higher emission levels, we got our most important finding. We saw that there actually is a threshold when environmental degradation stops being a necessary byproduct of economic development. In other words, pollution rises with industrialization before falling. This is because as countries become more developed, the nature of their economic output change. We can see this very clearly in case of US and China, US being developed country whose emission levels went down by the end of the period observed, while China, developing one, passing from agriculture to manufacturing as a nature of economic output, therefore polluting much more. For countries that are biggest polluters, what sectors are the main contributors? We found power sector to be most often the main contributor, followed by transportation. Here in this slide, we see it in the case of China. These results are completely compatible with information found online. Indeed, according to EPA, most greenhouse emissions come from burning fossil fuels for electricity, heat, and transport. Third question. For biggest polluters, which greenhouse gas presents the main problem? Looking at specific greenhouse gases, here our data was actually inconsistent with other projects we found online, possibly due to the lower data quality. And finally, we checked for possible negative effects of high emissions on some demographic factors. First, we tried to see if there is a change in fertility or birth rate in countries that are the largest polluters. We found that decrease in birth and fertility rate cannot be attributed to negative effects of emissions, but is rather a trend happening all around the world. To check for this, we compared these trends in countries with the highest and lowest pollution levels. In the fifth research question, is there a change in mortality rate and life expectancy in countries that are the largest polluters? We took the same approach. And looking at the length of life, we notice how people live longer anywhere in the world, but especially in high emission countries. Now, this is not to say that emissions do not have negative effects on human health, but rather that these negative effects are overpowered by much greater positive effects on human health coming with increased production, which is higher GDP, and therefore better life and health conditions of all. Now, we would like to add that it would have been interesting to have data that would help us understand the extent of negative impact of emissions on human health. Finally, our last research question was, are biggest polluters also the most urban places? We found that as countries become richer, they also become more urbanized, meaning that relationship does not go through emission levels, but rather through GDP. Conclusion. We would like to conclude by saying how a country has to act on two battlefields in order to ensure its sustainable development. First, it has to increase its living standard so that it is in position to lower negative effect on human health of existing emission levels, while also working on trying to reduce that existing level. Ultimately, our main takeaway is that GDP growth has its negative effect in terms of high emissions, but two are not inseparable. Therefore, to limit the extent of negative externalities for trying to grow your GDP, focus should be on finding a way to fasten up the process of industrialization of third world and developing countries when emissions are the highest, while also finding new ways to be more energy efficient. Thank you for your attention.